In the last video, we looked at the traditional Jewish reading of Psalm 22:17, like a lion, my hands and my feet. We talked about how this is the majority reading in extant Hebrew manuscripts. In other words, it's the most widely attested reading. But we also talked about some of the problems with this reading, the main one being that it has no verb to indicate the relationship between the lion and the psalmist's hands and feet. The reading is hermeneutically and syntactically problematic, therefore, and explanations for why this verb was omitted are not very convincing. We looked at two such explanations, one that the verb was accidentally omitted through a copyist error, and two that the verb was purposely elided. In this video, we're going to be looking at the minority reading, Karu Yadai Veraglai. They dug my hands and my feet. Now, when I say that this is the minority reading, I mean that, although it's attested in some Hebrew manuscripts, the manuscripts that attest, like a lion, my hands and my feet, are far greater in number. All right, but this doesn't necessarily mean that the majority text is original. We also need to take into consideration the date of these manuscripts and other external support, such as early translations of the Hebrew into other languages. Additionally, we'll need to consider whether the reading has any good internal support. In other words, whether it fits with the psalm's context and cultural situation. To do that, we'll have to touch on some hermeneutical and lexicographical issues. Okay, so let's begin by talking about some of this external support for they dug my hands and my feet. The reading finds some very ancient support from the Greek translation of the Book of Psalms known as the Septuagint. By the way, the term Septuagint originally referred only to the first 5 books of Moses. The translation of these books was supposedly commissioned by King Ptolemy Philadelphus in the first half of the 3rd century BC, and the translation was supposedly carried out by 72 Jewish elders, 6 from each of the 12 tribes. So I'm not really sure why it was called the Septuagint and not the Septuagint Duo. One hypothesis is that it was originally dedicated to the Jewish Sanhedrin, that is, the Jewish High Court, which was comprised of 70 elders. But be that as it may, it's important to realize that it wasn't just the books of Moses that came to be translated into Greek. By the end of the Hellenistic period, many Jews were living outside of Jewish lands and were more conversant in Greek than in Hebrew. There were large Jewish settlements in northern Egypt, for example, in Syria and Rome. These are places where Greek was the lingua franca. In other words, the language that people of diverse linguistic backgrounds needed to know in order to engage with one another and participate together in society. Even in the lands of Galilee and Judea, many Jews were no longer fluent in Hebrew. And so there was a great demand, not just for the 5 books of Moses, but for all the inspired books of Scripture to be translated into Greek. And so translations of other biblical writings were produced during the late Hellenistic and early Roman periods. As Greek translations, these books now came to be included in what people referred to as the Septuagint. We don't know who the translators were for these books, but we do know that virtually all of them, if not all of them, were translated before any books of the New Testament were written. In fact, when the New Testament authors quote from the Old Testament, they often rely on the Septuagint, as can be illustrated from many quotes in the New Testament. Now, I've sometimes heard folks on the internet claim that it was Christians, actually, who translated some of these books, say the Book of Psalms.
So the Jewish scriptures, the Hebrew Bible, listen very carefully, it's going to be offensive, was raped. I selected that word, was raped by the church, not by these innocent, sweet Baptists from Arkansas. These young men and women have no idea this has been done. Was altered by the church in order to make it appear Christological. This was done in the 2nd century, a very long time ago. Christians are not walking around going, oh, I'm really lying here. They really believe it says they pierced my hands and my feet. Now here's the caveat. You mentioned the Septuagint. So if you pose this to a Christian, if you go to your pastor and say, you say, hey, what's going on here? I heard a rabbi say that in the original Hebrew it says, like a lion that ran out of my hands and feet. What's the deal? Why does it say this in my King James? So this, I guarantee you, is going to happen. You'll say, well, in the Septuagint, which is a very old translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek, older than Christ, that's what you're going to hear. It says they pierced my hands and my feet, and it's true. But here's what's not true. Here's the scam. Here's the shell game. This is standard fare in seminary. They're told that the writers of the New Testament, that they were just following this ancient Greek translation of the Bible. Now, what's the story about the Septuagint? You can hear the Latin word Septuagint, you hear 70. As the story goes, 2,200 years ago, a Greek king of Egypt wanted to have for his library in Alexandria a translation of the Torah of Moses, of the 5 books of Moses, of the Pentateuch. He took 70 or 72 great learned men. We know this. We know this from 50 sources. And they translated the Torah, that means the Pentateuch, that means the 5 books of Moses, into the Greek language. That was the first time that we know of that the Hebrew Bible was ever translated into a foreign language. Okay. Now I'm going to call it the scam, but I want you to just don't go back to your pastor and start yelling at him, because your pastor doesn't know any better. He's I'm sure, a good guy, a terrific lady. She's a terrific lady. This is what they're told. So what happens is they say, so in that Septuagint, these learned rabbis translated Psalm 22, verse 16 as pierced. That's the scam. The original Septuagint was only the 5 books of Moses. The book of Psalms is not part of the 5 books of Moses. The book of Psalms is in the writings part of the Jewish scriptures. The Hebrew Bible is divided into 3 major sections. That's why it's called Tanakh. The Torah, the 5 books of Moses, that's the law of Moses. You have the prophetic writings, and that would begin with Joshua and then with the book of Malachi. And then you have the writings, the wisdom literature, which includes the book of Psalms, Proverbs, and so on. So this section of the Bible was never translated by those rabbis into Greek. It's nonsense. What happens later is that eventually there'll be demand throughout Egypt and throughout the empire, where Greek is the lingua franca. Let's render the whole Hebrew Bible into Greek. And the church is going to do this. The most important figure in all these translations, and many of them produced, is going to be Origen. Origen is a 3rd century church father. Everything I'm telling you is standard scholarship. There's no conspiracy here. So here's what happens. So there are loads of these Greek translations that are produced, most by the church. So now this is the last part. I want you guys to get this. Every time somebody, whether it's in the 1st century, 2nd century, 3rd century, would produce their Greek translation, what do you think they would call it? They wouldn't call it Harry's translation. Every Greek translation takes the name Septuagint because that's the name. That's the name that has fixed. So therefore, the name becomes genericized. So every subsequent Greek translation is called a Septuagint. Those are from the 3rd century. Those are done by Origen. Origen was only one of 2 church fathers. You're going to find this hard to believe. Of all the church fathers, only 2 were completely fluent in Greek and Hebrew. 2. That's it. Origen, 3rd century. Jerome, 4th/5th century.
So according to Tovia Singer, the Septuagint translation of the Book of Psalms, and other books as well, apparently, were produced in the 3rd and 4th centuries by Christians, not by Jews. Well, suffice it to say that such a thesis would be extremely difficult to defend, and is certainly not the view of mainstream scholarship. For one thing, Origen never claims to have come up with a new translation of the Hebrew Bible. I think he would have claimed that if he had, or we would have at least heard about it from someone else. What Origen did was compile what is called the Hexapla, which was kind of like the first parallel Bible. It had 6 columns. It featured the Hebrew and the 4 main Greek translations of his day, including not just the Septuagint, but Aquilla, Symmachus, and Theodotion. So Origen did produce the Hexapla, but he did not produce the Septuagint translation of the Psalms. As we'll discuss a bit later, Psalm 22:17 is already cited by Justin Martyr about 3/4 of a century before Origen. Justin wrote in the mid to late 150s AD, and he quotes the text in the same form that we find in the Septuagint. He also quotes Psalm 22 in its entirety, and again it matches up with the Septuagint. Going back even further than Justin, many verses from the book of Psalms are quoted by the so-called Apostolic Fathers and by the authors of the New Testament. Once again, the quotes match up most frequently with the wording of the Septuagint. Perhaps Tovia Singer will try to dismiss this evidence on the grounds that these were all Christian authors, but this kind of approach isn't going to work. If the Septuagint translation of the Psalms and the translations of the other non-Pentateuchal books of the Old Testament were produced by Christians, it would be extremely difficult to account for this almost uniform agreement between so many Christians who lived in so many different parts of the world, going all the way back to the earliest writings of the New Testament. Origen certainly didn't go around collecting all of these writings, forcing them to line up with some translation that he had produced in the 230s or 240s AD. Such a proposal would be ridiculous. And so, if someone wanted to argue that the Septuagint translations of the Psalms and the other non-Pentateuchal books of the Old Testament were of Christian origins, one would have to posit that these were produced by some unknown Christian of the very first generation of Christians, and that these translations were universally distributed to all the churches throughout the world and universally embraced by Christians as the one official translation of Scripture. That just seems entirely implausible, especially when we have evidence that Jewish authors were using the Septuagint long before Christians were. Eupolemus, for example, who was writing about 150 BC, quotes the Septuagint of 2 Chronicles and uses several proper names according to their Septuagintal forms. Pseudo-Phocylides, who probably wrote around the turn of the era, was obviously familiar with the Septuagint translations of the prophets and wisdom literature. We also have this important statement in the prologue by Joshua ben Sirah, which dates to the latter half of the 2nd century BC. He alludes here to Greek translations that had been made not just of the law, but the prophetic books and what he calls the other books, that is, the Ketuvim, or writings, which would have presumably included the book of Psalms. We also know of another important Jew who quotes from the non-Pentateuchal books of the Old Testament, and his wording once again lines up with that of the Septuagint. I'm talking here about Philo of Alexandria, who flourished in the first half of the 1st century AD and probably died around AD 50. I'll just stick here to his quotes from the book of Psalms. He actually quotes from a number of Psalms, and at least in all the examples that I've examined, his wording always matches that of the Septuagint. Bear in mind that Philo was not a Christian, and was probably writing before most, if not all, of the books of the New Testament were even written. What you're seeing on the screen is from a book by H.E. Ryle, which he published in 1895. The book includes a comprehensive study of Philo's quotes from the Old Testament. These are all the quotes that Ryle could find in Philo's writings from the book of Psalms. The quotes are characterized as being in agreement with the, quote, Old Greek. Old Greek is just another designation that scholars use to speak about what I've been referring to as the Septuagint. So don't be confused by that. So I think it should be beyond any reasonable doubt that the translation of the book of Psalms, which comes down to us under the name of the Septuagint, was not produced by Origen or by any other Christian. It was quoted by many authors who lived before Origen, not just Christian authors, but Jewish authors as well. So the claim that we heard from Tovia Singer is simply not credible. As I said, Singer is very much out of step with mainstream scholarship on this issue for the reasons that I've mentioned. Here's a quote from a Jewish scholar who's done a lot of work in the Septuagint, named Emmanuel Tov. Tov is obviously not in agreement with Tovia Singer on this issue. So I think we can set aside this whole claim about Christians being responsible for translating the non-Pentateuchal books of what we call the Septuagint, or Old Greek. Whether we're talking about the book of Psalms or any of the other books of the Hebrew Bible, these translations were undoubtedly pre-Christian and therefore presumably Jewish. A more modest and more credible argument that someone might make against the reading that we find in the Septuagint of Psalm 22:17 is that early Christians tampered with this particular text. It's undeniable that Christians did at times tamper with biblical texts, and this would include texts from the Septuagint. For example, in Psalm 40, verse 7, the word soma, body, is used in the Christian codices known as Sinaiticus and Vaticanus. Meanwhile, the word otia, ears, which matches better with the Hebrew, is attested in the Gallican Psalter. This was a Christian translation, and it was done in Latin, not Greek, but it was made on the basis of the Greek Septuagint in Origen's hexapla. So it probably preserves the original Septuagint reading. Christians likely altered this word to body because of how this verse is cited in Hebrews 10:5. Also, here's an example of a Christian interpolation into the book of Psalms. In Romans 3:12-18, Paul quotes from several biblical texts, mostly from the book of Psalms. The first is from Psalm 14:3. And so in codices Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, a Christian scribe has interpolated into this verse all the other texts that Paul cites, effectively turning verse 3 into a much longer verse. Now, it's obvious that this is a Christian interpolation because this same string of scriptures only occurs in the book of Romans. On top of that, the interpolation is missing in Codex Alexandrinus. So we definitely have examples of Christians modifying the Septuagint text. But I don't think that this is why we find the verb ὤρυξαν, they dug, in the Septuagint's rendering of Psalm 22:17. After all, they dug is not unique to the Greek, but is also attested in Hebrew manuscripts, as we'll see in a moment. Furthermore, they dug can be fully explained without reference to any distinctively Christian beliefs about Jesus. We can safely assume, therefore, that the Septuagint rendering of the book of Psalms predates its use in the New Testament, and its rendering of Psalm 22:17, which I've given here, is not the result of Christian tampering. We have every reason to believe that this was a genuinely pre-Christian, Jewish rendering. The verse reads as follows: "For many dogs encircled me. An assembly of evildoers surrounded me. They dug my hands and feet."